Readers, listeners, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I'm so pleased. Today we are going to dive into two novels. It's a twofer by André Aciman. Call Me By Your Name and Enigma Variations. So I learned a term recently that I had never heard before, which is the atmospheric novel. And I had a sense of what this would be, this atmospheric novel, but I also did a lot of thinking about what this person was talking about and really enjoyed this idea of a novel that so firmly speaks of a place and is so kind of rich and so full of a certain kind of ambiance that we really think of it as mostly being atmospheric. And the reason I thought of André Aciman is because I was totally obsessed with the movie Call Me By Your Name when it first came out. And what I loved so much about that movie was simply the feel of it. I loved this idea of being transported to Italy. I loved everything about that house, the weather, the beach, the beautiful people. Everything in it just really spoke to me on a very sort of sensorial level. I did have some problems a little bit with the movie, in part because I was concerned about the age difference between Armie Hammer and Timothée Chalamet. I really, really loved the atmosphere of the movie. I found myself watching it like 3 and 4 times, just like I would have it on in the background while I was doing stuff because I would love to just look over and feel the mood of it. I had never read anything by André Aciman, and so I was really excited to see how that kind of ambiance, that kind of atmosphere transferred onto the page. And I was not disappointed. I actually started with Enigma Variations, and then I went back and read Call Me By Your Name. So I think that I kind of read them in the wrong order because Call Me By Your Name came out in 2007, and it's very much about a young boy, not a young boy, it's about a young man's experience of grappling with his own sexuality. So it came out in 2007, and it is about someone who is 17 years old. And there are pieces of it that can be read, I think, as fairly autobiographical. I'm not that interested in doing that. But what is interesting to me is that the person in Call Me By Your Name, Elio, who is at the center of that book, has a lot of similarities with the person at the center of Enigma Variations. I really, really liked both of these books. I had, small quibbles with both of them, but I really, really enjoyed looking at them as atmospheric. So what do I mean by atmospheric novels? I think it's probably fairly clear right now. It's really just a novel that is so steeped in mood and time and place that we really identify it with its surroundings. And André Aciman is just an absolute master of this atmospheric novel. Some brief examples of this kind of atmospheric novel that we think about. A lot of the Gothic fiction, so you think of Dracula, you think of Frankenstein, you think of, all of these things that have castles and thunder and lightning and the weather is crazy and everything is damp and creepy and dark. That is a very atmospheric kind of novel. I also put all of those Nordic books that I just absolutely love. I mean, I shouldn't say all of those Nordic books, but a lot of books by Tove Jansson, who is a Swedish writer, who I believe she writes in Swedish, but she's Norwegian. I think that's what it is. But that is a whole body of work that is very, very much steeped in atmosphere. Same with Karl Ove Knausgaard. All of that My Struggle, and actually all of his work is very heavily sort of placed in its setting, and everything that is happening in Sweden is very sort of grounded, and in Norway it's all very grounded in the geography and the weather and the feel and the lightness and the darkness of those places. So those are all novels that I think of as being very atmospheric. I also think I'm a sucker for a good old college, a good old campus novel. And I think campus novels are often very atmospheric, especially if it's something that's a little more, if it's perhaps a throwback in time. You can get a real sense of nostalgia, but one that is very firmly based in the feel of a college campus. So that's a little bit less atmospheric in some ways. But when we look at work that is very heavily tied to its setting, and by setting I mean both place and time, you can really get a sense of that. So I want to dive in and give you a quick agenda. First, we're going to talk briefly about a little biographical information about André Aciman. Then we're going to dive in and look at the cover art on these 2 volumes that I have that I find so appealing. Anyone on YouTube can take a look here and see that I've really sort of leaned in to the color scheme and the aesthetics. You'll also notice I've got sort of like a Roman, you can't really see it, but that's like I think it's like some sort of wolf, or not a wolf. Maybe it's, I don't know what it is, but it's being stabbed by a Roman guy. And behind it is a portrait of my grandmother, actually. And then here we have a paper mache peach, which those of you who have either seen Call Me By Your Name or have read the novel know, in fact, that the peach is very central. It's actually a very interesting and really a very excellent piece of figurative language that we, if we have time, we will take a look at. I also really enjoy this kind of Grecian nod here. And then again, of course, this color scheme. So I'm trying to create a bit of an atmosphere here so that you can kind of, really sink into this idea of atmosphere and what André Aciman is providing for us. So quick discussion on the cover art. We'll talk about the titles of the 2 works, and then we'll look a little bit at the language, at the prose at the beginning of each of the 2 works. We will then take a look at figurative language, which he does some really interesting things actually with figurative language, some of which I really loved and some of which I was a bit medium on, but it is a unique way to work with figurative language. And by that, I mean metaphor, simile, pathetic fallacy, symbolism, any kind of examples of language that is doing more than just denote something. We're also going to look a little bit more at language in general, because in fact, this language feels very sort of old-fashioned in lots of ways, and it really does add to this atmosphere. There's a timeless quality to both of these novels, which is interesting because at times we have enigma variations very clearly set in its different eras. And same with Call Me By Your Name. Occasionally there's a nod to the 1980s in Italy, but mostly they feel incredibly timeless. And part of that is this kind of old school language. We're also going to talk a bit about structure. So Call Me By Your Name follows a relatively, sort of straightforward novelistic structure, but Enigma Variations, very much after its own title, is a structure that is very interesting. It's kind of interlocking stories, which is a form that I really like a lot, and I think that André Aciman does some amazing things with these kinds of, with these variations. Okay, and then we're going to wind up at the end by talking about this exploration of sexuality and why I think it is so well done in lots of ways, and also a couple of my reservations. It was very interesting reading these as a 54-year-old woman, so we're going to dig in a little bit to that. Speaking of being a 54-year-old woman, let's dive into André Aciman's biography. He was born in 1951. This is very interesting to me. He is Italian-American, but he was raised in Egypt, in Alexandria, and his family was Sephardic Jews. So they came from Spain. During the Inquisition, a lot of Jewish people left, for very good reason, left Spain. And in fact, they at some point, his family ended up in Egypt. And his father had a knitting factory, which, I mean, again, you guys know I'm a fiber artist. A knitting factory is a little bit less appealing to me than good old-fashioned hand knitting. But I would love to have seen it. I would love to have seen the knitting factory. And his mother was deaf, which I don't know, what the impact of that is, but that was one of the things that they mentioned in Wikipedia. And the one thing that struck me about this idea of his mother being deaf is that he grew up in this household of people who was French speaking for the most part, but there was also Italian, Greek, Ladino, which is kind of like a Spanish kind of Hebrew, and Arabic. So he was someone who was steeped in the sort of, melting pot, or salad. I think we're supposed to say salad now. All of the flavors getting mixed together, but maintaining their integrity. We are no longer a melting pot, for those of you who didn't get that memo. But he was in kind of a salad of families, a salad of languages in his home. And I really think that that is one of the main reasons why there is so much playful use of language and so much attention on translation, and just this idea of testing out lots and lots of different words and different metaphors, and the prose is just very carefully honed. And to me, it really feels like something that comes from someone who pays a lot of attention to language and who has grown up with a real sensibility about the nuance, among different languages, and some of the limits and also some of the opportunities in translation. Lots of translation in Call Me by Your Name. It's sexy translation. Okay, so in 1965, things got uncomfortable in Egypt for his family. So his parents bought Italian citizenship for everyone. He and his mother, and I think he has a younger brother, they moved to Rome, and his father moved to Paris. In 1968, when he was 17 years old, they moved to New York City. And when he was 37, I think he went to Columbia, or NYU. Can't remember, don't have it in my notes. But I do know that he earned a PhD from Harvard in 1988 when he was 37 years old. I actually don't have written down in my notes what his PhD is in, but clearly he's someone who is highly, highly educated. And you see that in both of the novels, but particularly in Call Me by Your Name. He is married to a woman named Susan Winiot, or Wiriot. I can't read my own handwriting. And he has 3 sons, Alexander, and twins named Philip and Michael. So that is our quick, biography of André Aciman. And now we are going to dive into these amazing novels that I have seemed to have read as kind of a pair, and not for any real reason. He has lots of novels. He thinks the best one that he wrote, I think, is called White Nights. I think that's what it's called. But neither of these are apparently what he considers his very best work. Okay, so we're going to dive into the cover art and the titles. Because we're talking about 2 works, we're going to somewhat abbreviate this. So I really love the palette. The palette here is really speaking to me. I also really love that behind the 2 of these, the upper portions of these books, there are pencil drawings that are really interesting. So in Enigma Variations, we have what is very, in fact, enigmatic. And we have this pencil or sort of line drawing here of bodies. And what I love about it is it's really not clear what's happening. It's not clear what gender these people are. It's not clear, if they're having sexual intercourse, and if so, what their positions are. But I really appreciate, again, the kind of enigma of it and the subtlety. It's really just beautiful. I love the font. I love the palette. And I really love the photograph. I love everything about this. Call Me by Your Name has a slightly less enigmatic drawing behind the sort of title portion of it up there. It's a landscape of what looks like the coast of Italy, which is also very fitting. I also really like the photograph that is in the bottom half of this as well. So I'm really very happy with everything about this cover art. Again, André Aciman probably had very little to do with that, but I find this very successful and very appealing. So Call Me by Your Name takes on a lot of importance as a title because, in fact, it is, we're going to take a look at the passage, but it allows Elio, in fact, to come to terms and to really be sort of fully embodying, which is not a bad way to think about it, his sexual experience, and for him to really become sort of a conduit to himself, which sounds a little abstruse, but that will become more clear. But he uses his name during a sexual encounter with this other person. And when he does so, in fact, it sort of allows him to fully appreciate his sexual experience. And because this is very much like a coming of age and very much a finding of his sexuality, I loved the idea here that language is, in fact, a central part of this. And I love the fact that André Aciman is using this title because, in fact, this is really underscoring the ways in which using the name, like having Elio be part of the sexual experience, is, in fact, it's very affirmative for him. Enigma Variations is a title that's actually a little bit more, it's a little harder to pin down. It's actually, it's a title of a piece of music, which I did not know. Maybe people who are more in tune, no pun intended, with classical music already know this. But the Enigma Variations are, a piece of music that was composed, do we say composed, by someone named Edward Elgar between 1898, sorry, 18 Yes, 1898 and 99. So this is this orchestral work, and it was 14 variations on the same thing. Sort of well, it was variations on a thing. And in fact, in Enigma Variations and also in Call Me by Your Name, we have a lot of emphasis on classical music. So part of me was like, really, this kid's 17 and it's the 80s. Like, are we really that into classical music? And at one point, there's kind of this throwaway sentence in Call Me by Your Name where Elio says something about having grown up with a family with a professor for a father and, in fact, no television. So as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, wait, totally checks out then. So this kind of his calling and he's very, very good, in fact, at interpreting and sort of translating all of these different pieces of music, and he can play lots and lots of different variations. This is all in Call Me by Your Name. And then this notion of enigma variations, the idea of a variation musically, becomes even more important. And in fact, I think there are variations by Beethoven in the beginning, maybe Bach, in the beginning of Enigma Variations that, in fact, take on a very important plot point because the narrator's father and the person that the narrator has the crush on are people who both really love these pieces of music. Importantly, this Edward Elgar person, who at the end of the 19th century was writing this orchestral piece of music, he had a bunch of different friends, and each one of the variations was inspired by a friend. And it wasn't just like a portrait, it wasn't just a depiction of the person, it might have been sort of like a secret thing that only that person understood. So it's kind of an homage, which I really loved because, of course, that has everything to do with this structure of interlocking stories in Enigma Variations. This is a good time to tell you that we have this one, our narrator stays the same throughout Enigma Variations, but he has all of these different interactions with all these different people, most of them lovers, who kind of come and go in and out of his life. And so this structure of these interlocking stories is very much like the structure of the orchestral work, Enigma Variations. And then, of course, this idea of variations is very cool. Just because they're variations in terms of how our narrator is living his life, how he feels about himself, his age, his intensity of emotion, all of these things are varying. But then, of course, you also have this idea of enigma. And there is a lot in both of these books of men trying to understand themselves and their meaning in the world and their relationships with other people, and certainly their sexual desire. It has everything to do with sexual desire. So I really love this because, in fact, a lot of those things are enigmatic. So the idea of enigma variations is very appealing to me. Okay, and then we are going to dive in and take a look at the very first paragraphs of each of these. In Enigma Variations, we have this. I've come back for him. These are the words I wrote down in my notebook when I finally spotted San Giustiniano. Wow, I didn't ever have a hard time reading that on the page. Let me tell you, that's harder to pronounce than it looks. Let me start at the top. I've come back for him. These are the words I wrote down in my notebook when I finally spotted San Giustiniano from the deck of the ferry boat. Just for him, not for our house or the island or my father or the view of the mainland, when I used to sit alone in the abandoned Norman chapel in the last weeks of our last summer here, wondering why I was the unhappiest person on earth. So I love this. I mean, already we have this sense of atmosphere here. We have the Italian word, which was very difficult for me to pronounce. It's very beautiful, though. I really appreciate it on the page. But we have this already, the idea of a deck and a ferry boat, and even the naming of these things, the house, the island, my father, the view of the mainland, sitting in the abandoned Norman chapel. It's actually sounding a little bit Gothic. And the idea of summer, and this person, this idea of wondering why I was the unhappiest person on earth. We know that our atmosphere is going to be, it's an island. or at least, someplace you reach on a ferry, off of the mainland. And it also, the mood here, at least in the beginning, is going to be unhappy. It's going to be despairing. It's going to be longing. We're going to have things here about this person who is unknown, who we are searching for, also with the father. So we're setting up at the very beginning of this entire collection of interlocking short stories a lot of the very important themes that are in fact going to come up again and again throughout all of the pieces. Call Me by Your Name has a slightly different tenor at the beginning. So this was something that I did not love in the movie, and maybe because I have too much of an identification with this, having grown up in the 80s in California. So here's the beginning of Call Me by Your Name. Later, the word, the voice, the attitude. I'd never heard anyone use later to say goodbye before. It sounded harsh, curt, and dismissive, spoken with the veiled indifference of people who may not care to see or hear from you again. It is the first thing I remember about him, and I can hear it still today. Later. So this, again, slightly problematic for me. Later was something that people said all the time when I was growing up, and it didn't actually feel to me dismissive or harsh or curt. In fact, it just felt like relaxed and just like a promise of like, I'll see you later. It also got to the point where people just said late, which I actually like. Then I have a lot of fondness, in fact, for that, because it reminds me of my teen years. But we have at the beginning this idea of this person, Armie Hammer, of this Oliver, who is arriving, and already he is leaving. So this idea of later, this idea of everything being kind of in the future, is obviously very purposeful. André Aciman is a very, very, very good prose stylist, certainly very good at structure and at significance of word choice. And so what we have here at the beginning is a very important look at this idea that he is already sort of, he's already leaving. On the first page, he is departing. And that's something that gets lost, but is hugely important toward the end. And of course, as the reader, you have this certain tension because, in fact, you know that they are going to be separated at the end of the summer. But we have this whole kind of study on this idea of later, and Oliver always saying later, and this poor Elio thinking it's very dismissive. But then, as soon as we have this kind of meditation on that salutation, we then have this paragraph, which is where we are really digging into the more atmospheric feel of Call Me by Your Name. I shut my eyes, say the word, and I'm back in Italy. So many years ago, walking down the tree-lined driveway, watching him step out of the cab, billowy blue shirt, wide open collar, sunglasses, straw hat, skin everywhere. Suddenly he's shaking my hand, handing me his backpack, removing his suitcase from the trunk of the cab, asking if my father is home. So interestingly, we have a lot of the same kind of feel. We have a younger person. We have the presence of a father. We have this idea of an island. We have an idea of people coming and going. We have, the narrator thinking about arriving on the ferry boat or arriving on the ferry boat and writing in his journal. And here we have this retrospective by this older Elio, who is in fact thinking back to the arrival of this person, who he has this crush on, in much the same way that we see at the beginning of Enigma Variations. And then this idea of the atmosphere continues. It might have started right there and then. The shirt, the rolled up sleeves, the rounded balls of his heels slipping in and out of the frayed espadrilles, eager to test the hot gravel path that led to our house. Every stride already asking, which way to the beach? So all of this, everything that is evoked here, this idea of the tree-lined driveway, the billowy blue shirt, that sort of, all those vowels and the b, that kind of plosive sound there is giving a sense of the kind of shape, in fact, of that shirt. And the straw hat, the sunglasses, the skin everywhere, the rounded balls of his heels and the espadrilles, the gravel path, the heat, the beach, all of this is highly, highly atmospheric. And what Aciman is taking advantage of here is this absolute miracle that I like to remind readers of occasionally because I think we lose track of how incredible this is. But so obviously we are moving in time and space here. I am moving, I'm a woman who's 54 years old. I'm sitting here in Northern California, but I'm being transported to Italy in the 1980s. It's actually like a very timeless kind of Italy that I am being transported to. But it's hot, and I'm in the mind of someone who is male, which is incredible. But also, what's so cool to me is that as I am imagining the espadrilles and the gravel path and the tree lined driveway and the cab, all of that is the perfect way for me to imagine those things. So, you want a lot of description on the part of the author, but you also want there to be enough room so that you, in fact, can have, like, I mean, even the word espadrille is amazing, but like I'm picturing the espadrilles that we all bought the summer that I was 17 years old and was studying Spanish in Spain. I mean, it's nostalgic, but it doesn't even have to be nostalgic. When I'm reading about Knausgaard, writing about Sweden, I've never been to Sweden before, although I am like 9.8% Danish, which I actually thought I thought all of Scandinavia loved each other. And I met someone from Sweden and I was like, oh my gosh, we're countrymen. And that person was like, the Swedes and the Danes have never gotten along, which was a little bit awkward. My point is that when I think of Knausgaard, that is a world I have no idea about. And it's still miraculous, the way that I can picture it and the way that my vision of it, which is different from anyone else's, is really it's the perfect vision for me, as long as the mood is also well communicated, which it is, both with André Aciman and also with Karl Ove Knausgaard. So when we have a writer worth our salt, they give us enough room to conjure the perfect image. It's such a miracle. It's really, really incredible what this kind of atmospheric writing allows us to do with our imaginations. Incredible. So Call Me By Your Name, again, has a relatively straightforward novelistic structure. That was published in 2007. In 2017, Aciman does kind of a very different structure, which are these interlocking stories. So a lot ties them together. First, you have this first story that is quite a bit longer than the rest. I think it's like 80 pages, and the other ones are more like 40, 50, 60. So it makes sense to me too, because this is when we have the introduction of our narrator. This one really has a lot to do with the narrator's father. It has a lot to do with this very first experience of love and of sort of obsession and of like an awakening sense of sexuality. So all of that is contained in this first story. We also have the seeds of a couple of other things that are sort of blooming elsewhere in the novel. So we do have references throughout all 5 of the stories to San Giustiniano. So that place is something that we come back to and again and again. And just the idea of him as being an Italian person and someone who's, not at ease necessarily in New York City, which is where a lot of the novel takes place. We also, though, have characters who are seen again and again. One of them is Manfredo, or Manfredi. So he has different names, but he appears at different times, and we see him in very different circumstances. And it's very exciting when that does happen, because it's that sense of like you can't necessarily fill in the gaps, but you're seeing him at a different point, and it's like kind of catching up, on the story of an old friend that you've forgotten or lost track of. There is a character named Claire who comes up early on, not early, but comes up kind of earlier and then takes on a much larger role later. So I really liked the way that the characters were not overly developed, and you didn't feel like you were really learning everything about them, but you also never felt like you were missing information. It was just very satisfying and exciting to see them in different circumstances. So there were also a couple of prose passages that were hitting on these themes that came up again and again, the most sort of palpable of which is this idea of how you never know the signs of something, or sometimes that you always know the signs that were there retrospectively. So on pages 74, 93, 107, and 124, I'm not going to read all of those, but that's different. Let's see, 4 different spots where we have this idea of signs and of sort of tokens and omens. And when those sorts of meditations come up again and again, it's very satisfying again, because you have this idea of returning to a theme, but returning to it from a different place and with different information in hand, that really make it kind of that add to the significance of this concept. So he's also very good at pacing. And I think he's doing this kind of unique thing. So, pacing is simply the way that an author metes out information. And one of the ways he does it, which again, I think is unique, I mean, he's not the only one who does this, but it's a fairly unique, I don't think you can say that, but you know what I mean. It feels unique to me, where he backfills information. So you'll have, a scene will be rolling along, and then he'll sort of move backward and say, the day before was the first time I knew blah blah blah, and then it's not a simple digression, and it's not a simple flashback. It's this kind of backfilling, and it happened again and again in ways that I found really interesting. And you would start sort of waiting for it. You would feel a little bit like, wait, I don't have the whole picture here, but I think it's going to come later. So it's this very nice way that he has of meting out the information. So one of the things we talk about at the Foxed page is it's not enough. Well, it is enough to identify these different things, but it's always good to take one step further and say, like, so what? What is the significance of that kind of backfilling? And in this case, I really love the significance, because what Aciman is doing here is underscoring the way that memory works and the way that people find out information. So both of these books are written, retrospectively. They are first-person narrators who are writing about something that has happened in the past. And in both of these cases, the author, in the beginning of what is happening, when our narrator in Enigma Variations is 12, there's obviously a lot of information that he doesn't have yet. And so there's some backfilling on the part of the narrator, because in fact he has all of the context and all of the answers. We have it a little bit also with Call Me By Your Name. There are different pieces where, Elio is clearly struggling with something, and then his self after the end of the summer is able to sort of, complete the picture in some ways it's very cool. But I also love the idea of this backfilling of information as being sort of like, when you are an adult and you look back at these things, you're like, oh my gosh, like that's what was going on. So I think it's a really nice way where Aciman's prose and the structure of these stories is in fact imitating the way that our memory and our comprehension actually works. So one of the things that he does in both of these novels that I usually don't like at all is he uses a lot of the hypothetical. And some of you know that I did 3/4 of an MFA program at Bennington. And one of my teachers in particular was really not into the hypothetical. And I do think it's a little bit like when an author starts talking about dreams. I mean, they say, that was also from the MFA program, they're like, tell a dream, lose a reader. And I think there is something to that. I mean, I find myself when an author, unless they're unbelievably great, when they start talking about a dream, my instinct is to start skimming, because it just, for whatever reason, it takes me out of the story, which is of course ridiculous, because the whole story is made up. I mean, we might have very important information that comes out in the dream, although in most cases it would feel like a bit of a cheat, I think, if very important information came out in a dream, unless you're like Kafka or something. So this idea of using the hypothetical is like kind of frowned upon. And there is a lot of the hypothetical in both of these books. Sometimes it's used in like these like I wonder what you would have been like when you were a boy, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's a lot of maybes. It's like, maybe it was this, maybe it started then, maybe it started then, maybe it started then, or you were thinking this, or you were thinking that, or you were thinking something else. And usually I would have a hard time with these, except that in this case, Aciman often was playing with language in a way that was so deft and so interesting and so rich that I was like, you know what, go ahead and continue on with these hypotheticals, because I actually am really just enjoying this prose. The other thing, which is actually more important, is that a lot of the time, I think this hypothetical stuff, this questioning, like maybe it's this, or that, or that, or that, is because in both of these books, our narrators are trying to understand something. In both these cases, the person who is telling the story is trying to work out the significance. So it's not like, a story where we're trying to convey a certain thing or convince someone of something. In fact, it's very natural that the person would be like, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. So I do think that organically, this kind of hypothetical thinking made much more sense. So I want to take a look at a couple of examples. This was an example of the kind of hypothetical sort of stuff that doesn't sit particularly well with me. This at one point, this is in the story Manfred in Enigma Variations. And our narrator says this: "You probably were no different as a little boy, the kind of classmate everyone admires and envies but secretly hates. I can just see you leaving school, dutifully saying goodbye to your blah, 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 blah." So, again, like this did not do a lot for me. I'm like, okay, I don't need to hear like this. I mean, I get a little cynical. I'm like, I don't need this made up guy to be like making up a hypothetical thing about what, his potential lover was like when he was a little boy. It just didn't add enough for me. I understand why it would potentially add to the description of this potential lover, but it just doesn't quite work for me. But there's an example on 201 of a time when it did in fact work more. This is the kind of hypothetical that isn't so much like maybe it's this or maybe it's that. In this case, he's trying to figure something out and he's sort of testing hypotheses. In Call Me By Your Name, we have a lot of circumstances where Elio is trying to find out when something began or the significance of something. And one of the ways he does it is just by using or by using maybe. So this is at one point early on in the book when Oliver puts his hand on Elio's shoulder and Elio feels like he might melt like butter. This is at the bottom of page 17. "And why wouldn't I show him how like butter I was? Because I was afraid of what might happen then? Or was I afraid he would have laughed at me, told everyone, or ignored the whole thing on the pretext I was too young to know what I was doing? Or was it because if he so much as suspected, and anyone who suspected would of necessity be on the same wavelength, he might be tempted to act on it? Did I want him to act? Or would I prefer a lifetime of longing provided we both kept this little ping pong game going? Not knowing, not knowing, not knowing." So, couple of things here. This is, again, what we are doing here is we are sharing with Elio at this early point in the novel this question of like what exactly is happening here. And this kind of hypothetical, this sort of like, is it this or maybe it's that or maybe it's this, that kind of hypothetical is actually very effective here because in fact we as readers are also sort of testing these different hypotheses with Elio. One thing that comes up here, so in this novel, I did, some careful reading, and he's 17 years old, Elio is. He's between junior and senior year of high school, whatever the equivalent would be in Italy. And the Oliver character is about 10 years older, and he is a professor at Columbia University. So you've got a 27-year-old and a 17-year-old. I thought that like that to me was very palpable in Call Me By Your Name. I felt like Armie Hammer seemed a lot older than Timothée Chalamet. Also, just physically, Armie Hammer was so much bigger, and Timothée Chalamet is so slight. Timothy Chalamet is a very beautiful person, so he definitely added to the ambiance and to the idea of this being very atmospheric. But I was a little like, ooh, are we concerned about the sort of predatory nature here and the power imbalance? You've got a rising high school senior and a professor at Columbia who's 27. So I as a mom and as a woman who is 54 and as someone who's done a lot of thinking about power dynamics in sexual situations, it's in my mind, certainly, but I also was able to really, sort of sink into both the atmosphere and the questions that Elio is having. This might be a very good time, in fact, to read a quotation by André Aciman. And I heard this on a really incredible interview that he gave. And he says the following: "I wrote about gay love not realizing that I was taking on the taboo, because I wrote about it in a way that seemed so easy and so harmonious, so accepting that it never occurred to me that really I had to sort of bring in the typical villain. who kill gays, who beat them up, who bully them, who mock them. I didn't want to invite these people into the relationships. And finally, two men can have a good relationship and not worry. So I appreciated the fact, and I do appreciate the fact in both of these cases that ultimately these are very positive experiences. Not without their sort of fraught moments that Elio in particular has to process. But in both of them, you have men at the center of these novels who are attracted to both men and women. I loved the fact we're now just headlong into the discussion about sexuality, which is great. I loved the fact that in both of these cases, no one seemed to need any sort of labels, and there was a lot of acceptance on the part of everyone. Everyone seemed to know, that these were men. In fact, sometimes people knew before the men, had really sort of sorted out these impulses and acted on these impulses or desires. They're books about desire on the part of a man for both men and for women. And I just thought it was so beautifully done because it is exactly what Aciman says here. It's worth repeating. I wrote about gay love, not realizing that I was taking on the taboo. I wrote about it in a way that seemed so easy and so harmonious and so accepting that it never occurred to me that I really had to have the typical villain. So you do have this, again, this idea of harmonious and happy thing, this idea that men can be happy together and have, happy and very sort of satisfying sexual experiences. In both of these cases, the men are also attracted to women. So I really appreciated this idea of just exploring desire and exploring sex in some very explicit and very interesting and I think really well done ways. Which I will say it again, it's very difficult to write well about sex, and Aciman really does. He does a very good job, I think, of it. So I really appreciated this kind of exploration that had nothing to do, again, with labels. It wasn't people coming out. It wasn't people explaining their sexual choices. It was simply from the perspective of the person, really, working through what exactly their desire looked like and felt like at different points in time through their lives. I just really thought it was such a genius exploration. I mean, I wish that there didn't have to be, some of the shame and the second guessing, certainly in Call Me by Your Name, and even also at the beginning of Enigma Variations. But I think that all told, if you move through the entire arc of both books, it really is this sort of beautiful evocation of some of the conflicting feelings of any kind of sexuality, whether it be hetero or homosexual, but really just a beautiful depiction of the power of desire and just how sort of all encompassing it can be, which I thought was just so beautifully articulated. Okay, now we're going to get back to what we were talking about, which was these hypothetical, hypothetical passages that in both cases, again, would have bothered me, except for the fact that these are both books that concern this idea of sorting this thing out and really exploring the idea of what sexuality looks like. So trying on different hypotheses or trying even different language for things really made sense to me. It's another kind of so what, like, yes, he's doing these hypothetical things, but the reason he's doing that is because these are both narrators who are in fact doing a lot of exploration. So exploring different language variations is in fact a really a good way to mirror that. Okay. So another way that he's so good at mirroring this kind of exploration is with figurative language. So the main kind of manifestation of figurative language in both novels is metaphor or simile. So these are simply comparisons where an author will compare item A to item B, and by dint of this comparison, the reader will understand something better about item A, which is kind of the important thing. So it works best if the things are sort of logical in some way. If they're too far afield, it just feels weird or it's not very revealing. I mean, occasionally it is. But he just does such a beautiful, beautiful job with figurative language. This is another one where he'll have these long lists of similes, for example, or sometimes metaphors, where it feels like he's trying to figure something out, but meanwhile, he's evoking this incredible atmosphere in a way that I found so compelling. So we're going to look at first at Enigma Variations on pages 132 and 33. So here we have, this is a very apt passage because here our narrator in Enigma Variations is trying to figure out fundamental things about himself. And so you have these 2 pages of this kind of accumulation of metaphor that's really beautiful. Sometimes work gets in the way. Work keeps me busy. Work is my screen. My whole life is a screen. I am a screen. The real me has no face, no voice, isn't always with me. Like thunder after lightning, the real me could be many, many miles away. Sometimes there is no thunder, just lightning and then silence. When I see you, there's lightning and then silence. So we have this beautiful, first we begin with this metaphor, my life is a screen, and then this simile, like thunder after lightning, the real me could be many, many miles away. So, and then we have this beautiful like drawing in of the beloved here at the end. I see you, when I see you, there's lightning and then silence. So that is very evocative here of this idea that this lover is someone who is not apprehended easily by our narrator. Then a little further down, I'm shrouded in silence, like a beggar hooded in burlap, skulking in a cellar. I am a cellar. My passion feeds on everything but air, then curdles like bad milk that never goes bad enough. It just sits there. And if it wastes the heart a tick per day, still anything that touches the heart is good for the heart, is like feeling becomes feeling. So, I mean, this is getting like downright, lyrical here. And he is actually kind of losing me a little bit here. But again, this accumulation of things, whether, first being shrouded like a beggar in burlap, skulking in a cellar. I mean, the discomfort in all of those consonants and vowel combinations alone is really very telling here. But then this idea of I am a cellar, I really enjoyed that. Like he's this beggar in the burlap sack in the cellar, and then he becomes the cellar. So it's this idea of being uncomfortable and not being able to sort of sit in one place. It's like constantly moving and looking for ways to understand himself. And then down a little bit further, and yet you must be happy. You don't need anyone. You are like a walled citadel, proud of its battlements and of its colored pennants flapping in the summer wind. So I do like the way here that this, this citadel idea, it's so proud and it's so guarded, but citadel is also this beautiful word. I mean, it's not castle, it's citadel. There's something beautifully kind of feminine about that word that I really like. It also is a very nice echo, in fact, of cellar, which weirdly is another C, like a C that is pronounced in this sibilant form, cellar and citadel. So you have these beautiful echoes, one page apart of this kind of motif of the castle and the cellar and the beggar and the burlap. And then down a little further, even thinking that nothing can come of nothing gives me a leg to stand on. I mean, there's another, that's some sort of metaphor. Something to consider when I wake up. There's a little idiomatic expression for you. Something to consider when I wake up in the middle of the night and can see nothing. Not the blackout of my life, not the screen, not the cellar, not even hope and false comforts. Just the joy of your imagined limb touching mine. So here we have kind of a compendium of what has come before. I prefer the illusion of perpetual fasting to the certainty of famine. I have, I think, what's called a broken heart. I like the ending there, this idea of I have what's called a broken heart, because he's pointing attention to language and this idea of metaphor. I mean, a broken heart it's used so often that everyone understands, that we simply mean someone who has sort of heartache or someone who's very sad and is despairing about having lost, some sort of romance or something. I mean, heartbreak is obviously wider than just that. But we have all of this accumulation of these metaphors in a way that I find really actually very, I mean, you could argue that it's kind of too much, but I was totally taken by it, in part because this is a narrator who is trying to figure himself and, in fact, his many lovers out. So I found it just absolutely, really very compelling. We're going to look at figurative language in Call Me By Your Name on page 143. Just one example here. This is such a beautiful part of the book, and one of the things I liked is that this in fact harkens back to the title, this idea of saying his own name when he is experiencing sexual pleasure, because in fact it allows him to sort of fully kind of inhabit himself. He was my secret conduit to myself, like a catalyst that allows us to become who we are, the foreign body, the pacer, the graft, the patch that sends all the right impulses, the steel pin that keeps a soldier's bone together, the other man's heart that makes us more us than we were before the transplant. I just think that is so beautiful. And again, you could argue that this whole kind of like piling up of metaphors here is sort of too much, but I actually really like it again because our Elio here is groping for how to describe to the reader what this feels like. And I actually did not have a hard time kind of following him in all of these different directions. And I also really love the maleness of this here. So the idea of the steel pin that keeps a soldier's bone together, I mean, that's very sort of male, partially because it's a soldier. And when I think of soldier, I think of a man, which is probably sexist, but there it is. And then the other man's heart that makes us more us than we were before the transplant. It's so beautiful. I love the idea of the heart here because of the idea, of course, of a broken heart and of heart as having to do with romance and desire. But here, it being more essential about it here, it has everything to do with life and death. So we're sort of upping the ante in a way that was so effective. So I think this is a really excellent use of figurative language here. Not only just how evocative and beautiful they are, but again, this idea of Elio as sort of groping toward an understanding of his sexuality. So we're going to take a quick look here at the language more generally. So there is a formality in the language, particularly in enigma variations, which I thought was really interesting. In Call Me by Your Name, the English feels very, like any English speaker might have spoken it. There is a lot of, again, there's a lot of classical music, and there's a lot of talk of Ovid, and there's a lot of talk of very kind of, a lot of classic literature in the sense of like the classics, like Greek and Roman stuff. So we have this sense of like an elevated amount of education that's happening, but that makes sense because both Oliver and Elio's father are these professors, and Oliver is there in order to work with Elio's father. So you have a certain formality in terms of their references, but not so much of the language. In enigma variations, a lot of the language it feels like it's been translated from a different language. And I really appreciated that. So we're not going to look at too many examples, but I think that if if you slow down a little and you look at this prose, a lot of it feels a little bit sort of old world. There'll be expressions that either seem very antiquated. In both books, he talks at one point about biting his nether lip. And nether lip is not a common, at least as far as I know, it's not a common American phrase for your bottom lip. You would say your bottom lip. So this idea of nether lip, and a lot of the syntax, like the order of words, will feel a little bit more formal or a little like sort of stilted in a way that makes it feel like it's been translated. And that makes a lot of sense to me because especially in enigma variations, we have our narrator landing in New York, but he is someone who is, was born in Italy and spent all of this time in Italy. And so you have this sense of someone who is very conscious of language and someone who is maybe not, necessarily a native English speaker. But I love the ways in which this kind of old world diction and this formality kind of elevate the prose, not in the sense of making it more elitist, but they sort of make you more aware of the prose so that you have like a sense of this as being timeless, which is very important, but also a sense of this as being where words matter. And words are what are going to help both of these narrators understand their sexuality. So it's really a very beautiful way to call attention to the language in a way that is very, it's very endearing, I think, in lots of ways. So we have this idea of things feeling more formal and things feeling like they're sort of this translation. Like, for example, there's one point where he says, I wanted to come back on the morrow. Like, it's not I wanted to come back tomorrow. It's I wanted to come back on the morrow. And part of that, it's that kind of expression throughout Enigma Variations that makes it feel timeless, but also makes it feel, like it's being sort of directly translated from another language. It's actually very appealing to me and really makes both books more appealing. So you have this idea of translation that is happening, and this idea of kind of old world language and diction, which all adds to this atmosphere of being in a foreign, probably not supposed to say foreign, being somewhere else in the world, in this globe of ours. You're not supposed to say foreign language anymore. We say world languages now. But also, this language, through language, is the way that we are transported. So part of this transportation comes from the times when André Aciman is really engaging all five senses. And again, that is a way that this language, in fact, feels really impactful. So we're going to take a look at these times when all five senses are engaged. So Enigma Variations, right at the beginning on pages 4 and 5. So this is, again, our narrator is returning back to the island where he was young. But what I did as soon as I set foot on the ground after the old traghetto clanged and pulled out of the same exact spot a decade later was to turn left instead of right and head up the stone-paved path that led to the ancient hilltop town of San Giustiniano Alta. That was pretty good. I loved its narrow alleys, sunken gutters, and old lanes, loved the cooling scent of coffee from the roasting mill that seemed to welcome me no differently now than when I ran errands with my mother, or when, after seeing my Greek and Latin tutor last summer, I would take the long way home every afternoon. So this is such a beautiful evocation of this kind of atmospheric prose, but it is the language here in part that is lending to this idea of the atmosphere. And in fact, that atmosphere is timeless. We have language here that is not translated, that I can barely pronounce. And it's this really beautiful sense of being somewhere far away. And that even makes sense to me because, again, this is a narrator who is returning to this childhood place in order to figure it out. And this is someone who is making sort of an investigation in a land that is at once both very familiar and also soon it's going to become less familiar. So this disconnect between the reader and the language, whether that be because it's foreign or because meaning like words that we don't understand, like, Café del Ulivo, I think ulivo maybe means olive. I don't know. Who knows? But so this idea here of giving us lots of atmospheric language, but in prose that feels a little bit like it's been translated with some words that are in fact not translated is really part of why the language, I think, is so important in terms of the atmospheric novel. On page 52, we have another example of where he is really engaging all five senses. Our neighbors were having their kitchen painted. Suddenly, without thinking, I was on that cobblestone lane in San Giustiniano, headed uphill in a scorching late July afternoon heat, the shoemaker, the locksmith, the barber, every step marked by what the presage of that scent promised once I'd passed the giant cornerstone where the alley took a turn farther uphill toward the cafe and then up to the castle. The turpentine, I realized that day, was the cover, the cloaking device. So here we have the sense of smell engaged with the neighbors painting their kitchen and this idea of that transporting him back in time. But then, of course, we have the heat. We have this idea of cornerstone. I mean, even this idea, the evocation of stone here, an alley, the farther uphill toward the cafe. So cafe here is spelled in it's spelled in the Italian way. So all of this is engaging all of our senses. We have the idea of what he is hearing, what he is smelling, what he is seeing, and even in some senses what he is hearing because of the word cafe being in the Italian. So it's this really beautiful way that all of the five senses are adding to this novel as being atmospheric. In Call Me By Your Name, we have the same idea, this engaging of all of the senses on page 10 here. All these started the summer Oliver came into our house. They are embossed on every song that was a hit that summer, in every novel I read during and after his stay, on anything from the smell of rosemary on hot days to the frantic rattle of the cicadas in the afternoon. smells and sounds I'd grown up with and known every year of my life until then, but that had suddenly turned on me and acquired an inflection forever colored by the events of that summer. So it's so beautiful. I mean, here, this idea of the smell of rosemary, you can imagine what that is, but the idea of it on hot days, and then the frantic rattle of the cicadas. Rattle is such a good word there, especially when we have frantic. We have the short A sound, frantic rattle. It's that high vowel sound, but together with rattle. It's such a good evocation of the sound, but we also have the idea of the heat and the scent. And so all of those sounds and smells, all of those together with the language are really providing this atmosphere that is so good. And also, it makes so much sense to me that you would want to, in fact, here's the so what, you would want to engage all five senses when you are writing a book that is really, or two books that are both really explorations of sexuality and sexual desire. So this idea of combining scent and tactile sense and hearing and seeing all of that together is it's so masterful in books that really are everything to do with sensual pleasure. It's so well done. So the last thing I will say is, again, reading this as a woman was so interesting because a lot of this desire is desire that was somewhat unfamiliar to me. I mean, anybody reading about anybody's sexual desire is always sort of interesting to me because it's such a personal and such a specific thing. So I really loved the way that a lot of the language here supported this idea of the inarticulate nature of desire and how difficult it is to talk about sexual awakening and sexual desire, and even all of the attendant, doubts and difficulties and heartbreak and shame and all of the sort of all of the attending things, the joy and the bliss. And I feel like language in many ways is so deficient. And so what André Aciman is doing here with this beautiful use of figurative language and this beautiful use of atmosphere is just a very good way to approach this. I will say at one point, I mean, again, like as a 54-year-old woman who has three children and lots of young people in her life, I was like, oh my God, I hope they're all using condoms for all of this sex. And at one point, there was a part about condoms, floating in some lagoon like salmon or something, which was funny to me. This is in Call Me by Your Name. And at one point, there's and I actually appreciated this. There was some sort of a question about health, a health question that was asked in a very intimate moment, and I really appreciated that. And both partners say that they're okay, which it's interesting because it was the 80s, and part of me is like, are we talking about AIDS yet? I don't think so. I think it was early in the 80s that Call Me by Your Name is happening. But I mean, again, it's so timeless. It's a little hard to tell. So then I was like, wait, what are they talking about? Is this STIs? Is this AIDS? So part of me is always very curious about how authors are going to handle the idea of any kind of, protection and any sort of unwanted pregnancy. I mean, in Call Me by Your Name, Elio is having a sexual relationship with two different people, a man and a woman. And so I hope that's not a spoiler. And the whole time I'm like, oh, I hope Marzia's got everything under control. So I think there's some questions that come to my mind that maybe are not coming to everyone's mind. And I thought that he did a fine job of handling that. But that was one of the sort of questions for me that I was like, oh gosh, okay, this is not like a very sexy, no pun intended, sexy thing to include in this beautiful novel about sexual awakening. But also I was like, okay, I would love to have, like some modeling of safe sex here. And then I did also have a little bit of a hard time, as I said before, with the somewhat predatory nature of the 27-year-old and the 17-year-old. Obviously, it's better for me that Elio is telling the story, that it is his story. And I really, in both the movie and in the book, I appreciated the father's understanding of what is happening there. But I was a little bit like, gosh, I hope that people are having conversations with young Elio about, or maybe not, I don't know. I just was a little like, ooh, gosh, this is a little uncomfortable for me. Mostly, I really appreciated the fact that his father in particular, there's a conversation they have at one point where the father is very sort of pro-sex in certain ways, but also he says, I understand everything that you're going through. So there's a certain, attempt on the part of the father in Call Me By Your Name to really affirm the choices that Elio is making in terms of his sexuality. And so that felt good. And in fact, in Enigma Variations, the relationship of the father and son and homosexuality, it becomes a much bigger question. If you've only read Call Me By Your Name and you're interested in Enigma Variations, I think Call Me By Your Name is the better work. But I was very interested in the sort of expansion of the father-son relationship in Enigma Variations. But I really did, in lots of ways, I was very happy. And certainly in the movie, I liked the idea of people, being somewhat, upfront about physical pleasure and understanding that a 17-year-old boy would be having some sexual encounters and explorations. So I liked all of that. There's not even really a but, except that the age difference really was a little tricky for me. Also, weirdly, the audio version that I listened to, which was the Audible version, Armie Hammer reads it, and that was not great. I mean, I'm down on Armie Hammer right now for a lot of different reasons, and I don't. Even in the movie, I found him slightly miscast. I know he's supposed to be a little bit unlikable, but he's not someone that I loved ever, really. But so he is reading Elio's voice. He does a very good job with the Italian. I will tell you that right now. I have done a very bad job today, but you know what? I challenge him to say that word. Actually, he says it very well. In fact, he makes it deceivingly simple. But it's very strange, given that he, in fact, is Oliver in the movie, to have him then voicing Elio. I would have much rather have heard Timothée. I would rather have heard Timothée. I would much rather have had Timothée during the reading. But he's a busy guy these days, that Timothée. I don't think Armie Hammer's got quite as much going on, although I'm sure the Audible was made a long time ago. So maybe we'll leave it there on a bit of a light note. I loved both of these books, and let me tell you, summer is the time for atmospheric reading. So maybe I should have an atmospheric playlist on the YouTube station. I'm going to do that, atmospheric novels. Boy, I mean, that is a really beautiful thing, to really steep yourself in an atmosphere. And it's truly, truly one of the just absolutely miraculous things that reading can do. So get yourself back to the Fox page. Follow on Instagram if you're not doing that already. And happy reading.